the 2018 Commonwealth Innovation Forum, brought to you by Destination Gold Coast.
We're still on the topic of healing the people of the Commonwealth after that terrific address by Matthew Ames. And in a world where antibiotics are no longer as effective as they once were, a world where pandemic and biodefence preparedness are risks that need to be understood and managed, this session is vital. I mean, what are the health priority issues affecting the people in our Commonwealth nations, and what can be done about that? Let's find out, and a big thank you to the Queensland Clinical Trials Network for this session, which will be led by Dr. Hakam Yardi, OBE from the Northern Health Science Alliance. Please welcome Dr. Hakam Yardi.
Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Matthew for so eloquently reminding us of the urgent need to provide that equitable access to precision therapies for the right person at the right time with the right disease. And for reminding us that whilst we need to focus on fundamental and basic science, it's the application of that science to human lives that has the impact that we are also desperately looking for across the Commonwealth. So just one more final thank you to Matthew's contribution. Now, over the next 2 weeks, athletes from all over the world are going to be competing against each other at the Games. They're going to be trying to compete against their own personal best, and they're going to be trying to compete against those from other nations, hoping that they will make it to the podium. But whilst they're competing, they also share a commonness through the Commonwealth, but also through the endeavour that humans push themselves to compete against the very best and be the very best. And for me, there's nowhere else like medicine that needs that shared human endeavour to be at our very best and to be working alongside the very best to enable access to healthcare regardless of geography, regardless of social demographic. My name is Hakam Yardi, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Northern Health Science Alliance in the UK, a health partnership of 8 teaching hospitals, 8 universities across a population of 15 million people. And what brings us together is that shared responsibility of delivering the best health outcomes for the populations that we work with. We help our hospitals and universities both collaborate with each other, but also to collaborate with entrepreneurs, academics, startups and corporates from all around the world. And what we're seeing is the convergence of technology, of digital, of drugs, of devices, of diagnostics, of data, is changing the way we see medicine on a daily basis. At the same pace of that change, we're also seeing new threats and new challenges in our ability to deliver that care. And to discuss how we both tackle some of those challenges but start to also share some of the solutions, we've got an absolutely stellar panel who I'd now like to invite out on stage. We have Dr. Mark Blaszewicz from the Institute of Molecular Biology, University Queensland, Professor Mark Kendall from the Australian National University, Professor Alan Mackay-Sim from Griffith Institute for Drug Discovery, Dr. Michael May from CCRM, Professor Michael Nissen from GSK, Dr. Felicia Pradera from DMTC, and Emeritus Professor Marie Smith. Now, their full biographies are available on the app, but I am going to ask the panelists, in the context of the work they do, to contextualise what some of the challenges are that we face in delivering 21st century healthcare across the Commonwealth. I don't want to focus too much on the challenges. I think today should be about focusing on solutions that we can share both with each other and take away back to our own respective nations so that we can really focus on that collaborative sense that we've heard over the last day or so. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Marie to start us off in the context of some of the work you're doing. What are the biggest challenges you're seeing facing healing the Commonwealth?
Okay. So I work in the novel pain therapeutics field, and so point prevalence surveys in any country you would care to name show consistently that 1 in 5 adults suffer from chronic pain. And if you look at the population aged 65 and over, that rises to 1 in 3. So one of the big issues then is why is this so? And in terms of my own experience, it's in pain medicines. And so one of the big problems that we've got is that the medications that are available aren't particularly effective in many cases, or you can't escalate the dose high enough to actually get pain relief. So in the socio-economic terms, so Access Economics in Australia here estimated the cost of chronic pain to the community. So this is in direct healthcare costs as well as indirect costs, with people not being able to work, their caregivers having to work part-time or give up work to look after them. And it's a huge sum. In Australia alone, you're talking $34 billion per annum. That is the direct and indirect economic cost. And so one of the other problems is in the basic science research arena, so that is funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. We have labels that you can apply for a grant under a certain label, you know, cardiovascular disease, obesity, etc. There's nothing called pain. So pain is split up amongst, you know, clinical trials, neuroscience, pharmacology, and really we need to have some sort of overarching label to put that focus on addressing these issues. So there's been internationally a very large amount of basic science research, but one of the major challenges has been in translating that. So many promising new pharmaceuticals in rat studies and go to do the phase 2A, first in patient clinical trials, and failure to translate, with 1 or 2 exceptions, which I can talk about a bit later. So I would say that in terms of it's a global health problem, on top of which we have the opioid crisis in the US, which has got a lot of wise heads together and come up with a proposed way forward, which again we can speak about a bit later. So across the Commonwealth, this is a common problem deserving of a collective response.
Thank you. And Felicia from DMTC, what do you see as some of the largest challenges we face?
So my work focuses on the development of medical countermeasures, and for those who aren't aware, they're therapeutics, vaccines or diagnostics against chemical, biological, radiological threats, infectious diseases and pandemics. So I'm Department of Defence, working under secondment to the DMTC, but we work very closely with the Health Department. One of the biggest challenges that we've had here in Australia in particular is that traditionally we acquire our countermeasures as a commercial off-the-shelf. And we're in a unique region in Southeast Asia. We have a number of endemic diseases, and we have experts here that are capable of looking at and addressing some of these issues that we have. So I think the greatest challenge that we have as a nation is around translating those basic science endeavours, doing the advanced development and manufacturing, and having the capacity to do that. Because I look at it from a perspective that if we have another Ebola crisis, if we have Zika, we have these continuous threats that that are occurring, and particularly what's happened recently in the UK, we need to be prepared. We need to have the mechanisms in place where we can call on the right people at the right time to rapidly deliver a solution. So for me, my program, very similar to yours, is about engaging with industry, academia, the publicly funded research agencies to look at some of the things that may be a problem, but when something may occur, that we can down tools and rapidly fast track. So capacity building is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we have here in Australia and across the Commonwealth.
Thank you. And Michael, whether or not you're going to give a GSK perspective or more of an industry perspective on some of the bigger challenges that we're seeing. We were talking earlier that actually it can be about the commercial models for actually engaging as being a challenge, let alone the specifics of the science.
Yes.
It'd be interesting to hear from.
Yeah, well, I think there's no doubt that academia, industry and government actually want to work together, and they realise they have to do that in terms of pushing development and projects. But I think it's like any relationship that you have is actually working out the detail in terms of once you actually have a product, actually how are you going to share it and who's going to benefit from it. And I think we're still on that road at the moment, and certainly the Zika virus outbreak was a good example of that in terms of the potential for a vaccine is there, but actually then who owns it, and actually how is it going to benefit people at the end of the day is important. You know, I think that's the future, and I think we will work it out. But I think as a taxpayer myself, you know, and we're all taxpayers, we have some say in terms of what our government does, but also, you know, if you work or you have shares in a public company, you do want return on that investment. So it's finding that middle ground.
Okay. And Michael, from your perspective at CCRM?
Yeah, so the CCRM is the Centre for Commercialization of Regenerative Medicine. So we're focused on the promise of stem cells and cell therapy to cure disease, and also the fact that, you know, 75% of healthcare costs are around chronic disease and aging. And we were founded around, I think, a unique government program that focused more on creating the ecosystem for innovation and the networks for that, as opposed to focusing on projects or programs. So the CCRM model brought together academic institutions, 8 with access to their IP, used that, the reputation of those scientists to build an industry consortium of about 100 companies. And now looking at technologies from around the world and building companies, are now building the third network, which is an investor network, which is really there to fuel the system on the back of government investment. And I think that's the challenge that we're really focused on, is that scaling, that translation and scaling of commercialization to the levels where it can have sustainability and critical mass. So, you know, we have a team, and it's not just a network building exercise, but there's a team that fills important gaps, a team of 85, and we have infrastructure particularly focused in manufacturing, because manufacturing creates that stickiness and commercialization. But the end game, there are really 2 endpoints. One is attracting risk capital to really fuel it. And then the second thing we're doing, and actually why I'm in Australia and where I think there's real power in the Commonwealth, is taking this model and franchising it across the world, so that you have like-minded models and institutions collaborating with each other. Collaboration is, everyone talks about it, but it's actually very difficult to do. So our model is to create a network of networks that are all have the same mission, mandate, leadership, and speak the same language to get it done.
Thank you. And do you recognise some of those same challenges that Michael's articulated with the stem cell field? So, do you recognise some of the same challenges?
Sorry. Forgive me. I'm a neuroscientist, and I have been more lab-based and moving into the clinic, and I think a lot about translating the process from the lab into the clinic. And I also look at the world of the large drug companies, and I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in the world and in the Commonwealth is in drugs for the brain, drugs for neuroscience, drugs for ageing. drugs for neurodegenerative diseases. And there are these incredible statistics. At least 100 drugs have got to phase 3 clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease and failed. And similarly with motor neuron disease. And there's a whole list of these, and the result of that is that, if not all, then pretty much all the top 10 largest big pharmaceutical companies have closed their neuroscience research or greatly reduced it. So we talk about a lack of antibiotics coming into the stream. There's a great lack of neuroscience, drugs for neurological diseases coming in. And my feeling is that, I mean, there are a lot of reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that obviously the way they find the drugs is a problem, and they find the drugs normally by using a mutation in humans and then maybe putting that into a mouse and believing that that's a model for human disease. And so it's the wrong models. So this is where the knight on the shining armour riding a stem cell comes in, because you know, I'm an advocate for patient-derived stem cells as a way of finding new drugs, because these cells come from people and they reflect the genetic contribution that those individuals with that disease might have. So, and an advocate for taking a more... Cancer has been very successful in finding biological reasons for cancers and finding drugs repeatedly. And I think it's because they think of cancer as a cellular disease. And I think the problem with brain diseases is we keep thinking of it as a brain disease. And so our drugs are often superficially attacking the highest level of neural functioning, the way that the cells communicate with each other, and not thinking about, well, what's actually gone wrong with the cells at a cellular genetic systems biology level. And that's the level, of course, I'm so committed to and we're pursuing. But I think that's the challenge is now to use the variety of stem cell techniques to find new drugs as a way of a different model for these brain diseases. And I'm not the only one to say that, but I'm certainly advocating for that. The other aspect is cellular transplantation therapies, which are in progress using stem cells and other cells as we use, but they will be very expensive per patient, and they probably will be applied to patients who have a very long life of health costs, such that it makes sense to apply a large personal amount of money at the beginning in order to reduce those future health costs.
Thank you. And we've spoken before about the challenge not only being the cost of the product, but actually needing the infrastructure in place to be able to deliver it. So not only have you got to make the out-of-pocket or through the health system pay for the technology, you've got to have the infrastructure there to be able to deliver it. And that's going to be a challenge as well when you start moving or franchising between different nations.
Yes, exactly. And cell therapies will be the hardest to do that. Of course, drugs, you know, the main impediment will be the cost of drugs in developing countries, for example.
Mark, you spent your career trying to get drugs in through the skin and to develop new vaccines. What are some of the challenges you've seen firsthand through your career, and also thinking to the future as the technology is changing so rapidly?
Sure. I look at the sign up there, and the first word is healing. But I probably want to talk about a different word, which is infection, but not probably in the way you expect me to talk about it. So not in the sense that there's 14 million deaths per year due to infectious disease. That's a big problem. And the bigger part of the footprint of that is many of our Commonwealth countries. But there's kind of an unorthodox tilt on infection, and that's ideas and innovation. for about 20 years or so now, I've been putting things into the skin, taking things out with functional medical devices over in England, and also for quite some time here in Brisbane. One of the embodiments of that is a device that we call the nano patch. And I went to Papua New Guinea, one of our Commonwealth countries, a few years ago for a usability study, and saw firsthand the things that we know intuitively, but once you go there, you can see it and smell it and breathe it. The have-nots and the haves, if you will, in healthcare. But there was other surprises. So that year that I visited, all of Papua New Guinea only had 4 patents that year, the whole country, right? So 4 million people. And I sat down and looked at the number of patents I'd written that year. It was more than that. And I thought, this is a bit of a problem. And so that's a snapshot. Looking ahead, I'm serving on a thing with the World Economic Forum. It's called the Global Future Council on Entrepreneurship and Innovation. And it's all about the 4th Industrial Revolution. And what does that have to do with what we're talking about here? Well, healthcare is a huge part of that. In short, there's a tsunami of changes that are coming, and that will come with healthcare. And one concern that we have is that it could potentially just amplify the haves and the have-nots in healthcare, the differences between the two. So take as one example, roughly speaking, about 98% of the world's patents are generated by just what's regarded as the top 1% of the population. And that just doesn't make sense at all. We know great ideas can come from anywhere. So we need to work on ways to broaden that. And I'll tie it back to infection now, right? So it's infecting people in the sense of infecting them to have the confidence to chase their ideas, have the confidence to actually innovate and believe that they can do it, as opposed to receiving devices from abroad, these military devices, because they're made elsewhere, because they must be done better than us. That's something, as a country, we, not just military, but other cases, even here in Australia, we suffer from that, but that permeates in other countries as well. So I think that's an important challenge that great minds are put to work in this space and taught how to do it.
Thank you, Mark. And last but not least, another Mark. We've got 2 Marks and 2 Michaels on this panel. Who would have thought? Right, over to you.
Thanks. So I'm a researcher trying to discover new antibiotics, trying to develop new diagnostics to detect bacterial infections, and also trying to look at non-antibiotic approaches to treating infections. So, from my perspective, as Matthew Ames in the previous talk so eloquently presented, drug-resistant infections caused by bacteria are probably the biggest threat we face in the future if we don't do something about it now. And this was pointed out by the World Health Organization a couple of years ago in a report where they stated that if we don't start doing something now, we face a return to a pre-antibiotic era. And before the 1940s and 30s, about 40% of the population died from infections. And it has implications far beyond just what you might think of getting an infection. It affects the rest of the healthcare system. So chemotherapy will become untenable because you become immunocompromised, become susceptible to infections, and would end up with dying from a drug-resistant infection. Transplants, organ transplants, even simple surgery where you're given antibiotics prophylactically to prevent an infection from occurring. All these things we take for granted in our healthcare system suddenly are in jeopardy if we don't start working on it. So Hakeem wanted us to talk about solutions, and I think particularly in terms of innovation, we've heard in the talks yesterday that we need this collaboration between academia, industry, and government. And certainly for solving the antibiotic-resistant crisis, we definitely need that to happen. But I would add in a 4th partner, and that is NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, for helping to create solutions and drive innovation. Organizations like the World Health Organization, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust are absolutely essential to putting together a global strategy to fight this global issue.
Thank you, Mark. You've heard from each of our panellists on some of the challenges. We're going to move on to some of the solutions. If you've got questions, do use the app. We've got the screen here, and we will take them as they come through. I've got a few questions I'm going to get started off on, but hopefully we'll hear from the audience. And I've also had some questions already tweeted to me, so we can use some of those as well. Mark, you mentioned the fact that the word heal is up there in the title. But actually, a lot of what we're seeing now in 21st century healthcare is as much around prevention as it is around healing. And to what extent should we be using some of the solutions we're seeing to prevent ill health in the first place before we start thinking about the healing? Now, commercially, prevention isn't actually that sexy, because there aren't necessarily the products and the services to deliver to the population's need. I just wonder if anyone from the panel wants to pick up the importance of prevention, maybe from your work with DMTC around where that fits in terms of this sharing of knowledge across the Commonwealth. We need to share around the cures, but surely we have to share around the prevention as well.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of our focus is around prevention and preparedness, and so as part of my role within the government, we have with other members of the Commonwealth, particularly Canada and the UK, and also the US as part of it's a medical countermeasures consortium, and there are specific sort of focus areas that have been set up and tasks under that where we work collaboratively as part of looking at as potential solutions, but also countermeasures that can be used such that if our military or civilian personnel go into particular areas, they are protected from what may be there. So through vaccination, through biosurveillance, so understanding the environment in which they're going into to make sure that they have what they need in order to be able to survive and act and do what they need to do in those particular areas. But I mean, prevention is better than cure, and, you know, as the old saying goes. And so, I mean, if we can invest in that part of it and augment what we need to do and minimise, I suppose, from a responsive perspective, then you know, I think it all needs to work in chain together. So,
Can I just respond to that? You know, I think prevention and cure work will work closely together. We don't actually have too many cures yet.
No, that's right.
But when there is this, when cures are possible, then the whole commercialization context will change from treating symptoms, where you have products that are constantly supplied at a certain cost, to either the prevention and the cure being kind of two partners in the same game, and the whole commercialization model will change, I think, around that.
Yeah, look, I think prevention is very sexy, actually, and I think I work in the vaccines part of GSK, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we have across the Commonwealth is access to medicines, but also access to vaccines. And part of this is due to the structure of our societies between developed and developing economies. We're very lucky in Australia and some other developed Commonwealth countries where we have national immunisation programs. So it's just embedded within our system and people accept it. But there are a lot of countries in the Commonwealth who don't have access, and I can think of 3 vaccines that make a world of difference to paediatric and child health, and that's rotavirus vaccines, pneumococcal vaccines, and HPV vaccines. You take away those diseases and fundamentally you change economies, because you take away diseases that potentially take up a lot of time in terms of parental care, and the burden of childcare still falls upon women, and you dramatically improve access then to education and further opportunity through that. So I think we need to address some of those areas, because these vaccines in some of these countries are only available in the private market. So we need to think of strategies, and certainly WHO and Gavi are working towards that. But then as economies develop, they transition out of Gavi. So then actually how then do you maintain access? And I think that's one of the big challenges.
So
Both of you, who wants to come in first?
So I would take issue with the statement that there's not money to be made in prevention, and certainly for drug-resistant infections. Antibiotics, the reason we don't have a lot of antibiotics is the companies can't make a financial case to produce them because they can't charge enough. Yet prevention through vaccines, the Prevnar pneumococcal vaccine sells $7 billion a year. And so there's lots of money in prevention for those types of
So are there things
measures.
from the vaccine world, whether it be more the commercial modelling, the way in which the vaccine companies have worked with the health systems, that you think could be brought and leveraged across to antimicrobial resistance?
Definitely. I think, in terms of reducing the potential for getting infections, vaccines are a very potentially promising strategy to go forward.
And Mark, you wanted to come in as well?
It's slightly redundant now, but it was kind of the go forward on that discussion of prevention as well, the comment about it not being sexy. Actually it is. It's probably even sexy in ways we haven't even thought about yet. It's a dangerous thing to say. I'm waiting for the tweet to come up. So you look at what, so $7 billion was the sum, I think you mentioned. It sounds like a lot of money, and it is, right? But then you look at companies in the digital world. Facebook, interesting company right now, but it's valued an incredible amount of money. And where's the value? The value is the products, actually, the people and the data and the information. And so then you look at healthcare and what's coming with digital health and preventative health, where the data sets and what's happening in that area. You look at what's happening with wearables. So I think that there's an explosion of activity going on there that will change up how healthcare is done. It won't fix everything, and we touched on that a moment ago, the haves and have-nots. Offline we were chatting about, so what happens in the car industry? A big innovation happens, it starts in Formula One usually, and then goes to a Mercedes-Benz, and then eventually it'll end up in your Hyundai i30, right? But it's a 30-year, 40-year, whatever that number is, it takes a long time. Healthcare's a bit like that, I think. So it starts with the very lucky few, and then ultimately over time it's filtered, not filtered, but it comes across to other people. But vaccines, some of these vaccines we're talking about, not the three that you've mentioned, but others have been around for a very, very long time, and there's still problems in getting them to the last mile. So we need to find ways to hack that system instead of accept that, the Formula One to the Hyundai model. We've got to find ways to compress these things such that, coming back to HPV, Papua New Guinea is just up the road, and that's one of the highest incidences of HPV in the world. Anyway, I thought I'd mention that.
So we've had a question here around the potential disconnect between the health scientists and the ICT and digital, and the fact that we don't have anyone here on the panel from a more digital background, although many would argue that digital should be pervasive in everything we do. The comment was made yesterday that if you've got a chief digital officer, you don't know what you're doing, because digital should be throughout your whole organisation. Digital does have the potential, though, to democratise medicine and make it far more accessible across populations between the haves and have-nots. Have any of the panels seen examples where digital is being used to try and promote that access, whether it's through campaigns for education or actually access to new products and services?
Well, yes, certainly the issue around vaccine hesitancy is one area that's both being used by public health authorities, but also companies. And also it's being used by the anti-vaccination movement as well. So that's a very active space, and there's a lot of information there. I think the challenge is, how do you filter all of that information? Because as a layperson going into that, it's just laid out to you in terms of your Google search and the number of hits, or the way people have actually set up their inquiries. So I think search engines now are becoming more refined, and I think a little bit more socially responsible in terms of how that information is available. And you can then have this argument, well, does that interfere with free speech or not? But I think there are some public responsibilities. If there are certain things that are based on evidence, scientific evidence, and their accepted practice, they should be at the front of, inquiries. So I think that's one area, but there's a whole range of potentials. I think the issue around antibiotic use is a really important one, and travel is the other, I think.
And Michael, does digital help with the commercialisation of some of these technologies as well, in terms of getting it out to the audience and ensuring that you're creating technologies that actually work in the real world because you're getting real world feedback?
Yeah, so I think I have a couple of examples around that. One is that if we think of commercialization and innovation as being networks working together, networks are only sustainable if something has flowed through them. And we always think about money and resources flowing through them, but the only other thing that flows through a network is information. And we sometimes forget about the information piece. So in linking together, clinical networks with academic networks, with industry networks and government and patient advocates, that flow of information is really, really important to ultimately drive products that have some value. And it's actually amazing how often we leave the clinicians out of these public-private partnerships, which tend to go from basic research to industry and don't include the clinical piece. But another example from what we do is around something very technical, manufacturing. So manufacturing cells is very complex because you're working with a product that changes. And no country in the world yet has figured out how to scale manufacturing of cells to either clinical or commercial scale. And so we have a partnership with GE Healthcare that is developing new manufacturing technologies, but also finding ways to link unit operations in manufacturing, kind of from vein to vein, both on the liquid side, but also the digital side. So keeping track of that manufacturing through sensors and monitoring the growth and the development of these cells requires a lot of digital integration that surprisingly isn't as sophisticated as we would think.
Does that mean that only certain territories can get access to that technology because they need the infrastructure in place to be able to access it? Or when you say that it isn't as advanced, you think it actually means it can be more widely spread across the Commonwealth, for example?
But I think that as these technologies develop, and if you tie it to manufacturing, you will have hubs of manufacturing that will provide access to these therapies beyond the countries where they're manufactured. But the cost of these is a whole other question, and the accessibility, I think, is an entirely different question. And accessibility will vary in the near term among even developed countries within the Commonwealth, based on healthcare system. For instance, the difference between healthcare system in the US and how things are reimbursed versus Canada, I think will change accessibility.
You mentioned something earlier around not necessarily involving the clinician enough in the process, and there are a couple of questions coming through around engaging young clinicians, having clinicians access bigger data, and you also mentioned the flow of information through networks. I'm just wondering, has the panel seen good examples of where we've engaged the clinical unmet need to really understand what the population needs are, rather than constantly pushing innovation out, actually understanding what the needs are to align the innovation process with the requirements, whether it's in pain or anti-infectives or vaccines? And are there good examples that we should be sharing with each other and with the audience and with those watching online around making sure that we innovate into an environment that's actually going to accept that innovation? Alan?
I just make the comment that in the Scandinavian countries, their health systems keep track of everybody, all information from when they're born virtually until they die. So they have population-wide health statistics and details on every individual. And they're a great source of data for epidemiologists. But in Australia, and I guess other members of the Commonwealth, we would have to change our whole social view about privacy, as we're seeing, of course, now with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Privacy of health information, but that is the big data, isn't it? And that is that's the data that you could both get population data from, but also if you wanted to drill down and say, well, what's the success rate of a particular clinician? And that's one thing we don't have here, where clinicians, particularly in the private sphere, but also in public hospitals, people come in, they come and go, and if they don't come back, it was apparently a success. And as a scientist, I think, all that data, it's gone. They should be following this up. But so there's all these social changes that would require big data really well applied to healthcare, I think.
Well, you wanted to comment on the data angle as well?
Yeah, I really like the subtext to your question, or my interpretation of it is anyway.
Let's see what the interpretation is.
So what is big data anyway, right? I think what would be more powerful is clever data or big knowledge, maybe. Because, I mean, you think about, I think big data in its own right can make us really lazy. And I'll explain what I mean. So the Apollo mission going to the moon was done with the computing power of a Commodore 64 computer, which most people in the room probably don't know what that is, but a lot less than what you can fit in a mobile phone. So we're blessed by having all of this data, but I think we're becoming a bit lazy with it. So your question was, can you give examples of how it's been used for a particular healthcare outcome? I'll give you the reverse, and the reverse is take a look at Google's baseline project. So it's a good idea on one level. It's just let's instrument a whole bunch of people and gather all manner of data. So it's useful housekeeping, for want of a better term. But it's not really yet for directed interventions. So I think we still need, the good news is if you're smart, you still can take your tools and do some important healthcare things. The risk is, because all the data's there, we might not do much with it, or we think something will just bubble out from that.
So that sounds more like big data, in that it's not smart and it's not knowledge-based data. One area where we are seeing the smarter use of it is disease registries, where really well annotated electronic medical records that are bringing in technology and data from genetics, from omics, from Fitbits, so that you actually can build up a picture of a person and track their outcomes. I'm thinking in instances like disease outbreaks and in better understanding pain. How are you using data that spans the Commonwealth, or bringing different data sets together to get smart, not for it just to be big, but for it to be smart?
Well, the FDA has an initiative, public-private partnership, to tackle the issue of acute to chronic pain transition. And so that is involving clinicians, academics, scientists, and regulators, and companies, of course. And so that would, if at the conclusion of that project, is you can say, well, if the patients have these biomarkers, they are at high risk for converting to having chronic pain following a surgical procedure, for example. Then you know who to target heavy intervention at to prevent that ongoing massive cost on the community. So that definitely involves clinicians, and so that's a public-private partnership.
Felicia, and then on to Michael.
Yeah, so when we look at data, for us it's about who has particular capability and who's developing what product at what time so they can address a particular requirement. And so across the 4 nations, we have a collective tool called the Portfolio Tracking Tool. And each of the agencies and each of the nations essentially load in what's going on from a product development perspective and where they are in what we call the technology readiness level. So from, basic research through to the phase clinical trials. And this turned out to be very useful during the Ebola outbreak. So we were able to go to a centralised system and look at who had what capability, who was where in the development perspective, and then actually target investment into those to fast fast track that. So the collection of that has been really important, and the next phase of that has actually been what we call the broad-based capability, and that's looking at the expertise, the infrastructure, the manufacturing side of things, and tracking that across the 4 nations, such that again we can do collaborative programs if something, what happened, I use the Ebola crisis as an example, as the non-human primate facilities around the world became backlogged. And so it was a case of, look, where can we identify places that can be used in the development of diagnostics and potential vaccines to address that. And it was the ability to go to different nations and speak to them and work in a collaborative environment for that. So the data of knowing who exists is really critical in what we do.
Quick question, who are the 4 nations?
So the UK, US, Canada and Australia, and New Zealand's also a sort of part of that, so in the countermeasures, but not officially on the documentation, so they are an observer at this point in time. So.
And is it open for other nations to?
At the moment, no. It is just the quadripartite relationship, but individually each of the nations have sort of engagements mechanisms with other areas of the Commonwealth, and so there are still sort of discussions that are occurring for different aspects of things over with other nations within the Commonwealth.
It's encouraging to hear that data sharing between nations, and then what would be nice to hear in the future is that whilst you may not necessarily need to be a partner, just to access that information, learn, take it back, to be able to get yourself up to a stage where you may be appropriate to partner with an organisation like that. Michael, you had...
Just a comment about big data, but also clinical role. I think it's around the questions that we ask of the data, in terms of ask a good question, you may get a good answer. Ask a dumb question, you always get a dumb answer. And I think we're getting we're getting better at that. And I think the advent of modelling has certainly helped that. So with that expertise now, you can set up lots of scenarios that you can hypothetically test in models before you go to the clinic and actually trial that or run that. And I think the Ebola outbreak's a really good example, because no one had ever really trialled the ring-fence strategy before in a real-world setting until the Ebola outbreak. And now people use that and say, hey, it really does work. So that I think that's the example there. I think the issues around the public's concern around data, that's something that I think will evolve and be discussed in the public forum, but needs to be openly discussed, because I think in general the public does accept these issues as realities, but also moving forward. But then how do we maintain our individuality and privacy? Around the clinician's role, and I'm an ex-clinician, and I suppose I can give a little insight into this, is that clinicians are integral both at the beginning of any development process, but also the end. At the beginning, in terms of giving the insight in terms of what really matters to patients and their families, and the insights in terms of potentially how you can design a trial and actually whether it's realistic. But also at the end, because the other aspect of what we do with any intervention is safety, and that's always paramount. So you need clinicians who can assess safety, and they're an integral part of that in terms of any product, whether it becomes to market or not, whether it's in phase clinical trial development, is this issue around assessing safety. So clinicians are very important.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah, of course.
The internet lowered, I think of things in cost terms, commercialization. So the internet lowered the cost of collaborating. Computers lowered the cost of doing calculations, which is like modeling. The next wave is artificial intelligence, which will lower the cost of prediction. And that'll make the data that we're collecting perhaps smarter for us. But I think what people have to realize is that artificial intelligence requires a feedback loop. So what are the outcomes that get fed back in to have the computer learn from the data set. And so that rise of artificial intelligence will be linked very intimately with clinicians around those outcomes, and I think will ultimately help us predict in a way that will design clinical trials better so that they're cheaper, but also drive not only efficacy outcomes, but also reimbursement type outcomes. And that kind of consolidation and innovation, I think, will change healthcare and the cost to develop new drugs and therapies incredibly.
And to be able to do that, you've both mentioned the critical role of the clinician in this, in understanding the patient's needs, how the system works. But we're also going to most likely need a new breed of clinicians. Clinicians who understand AI, clinicians who appreciate the convergence of technologies. And there are quite a few questions coming through around skills development. So for 21st century healthcare, we're going to need 21st century clinicians who are upskilled in these areas. But the pace of the technology change, can we expect clinicians to be skilled in the art of blockchain in healthcare and AI, or is this round collaboration? One of the questions.
We need 21st century collaboration. We not necessarily have to train everyone to know
I think
everything.
it's a danger actually putting that all on clinicians. What we need is a cross-functional team. We need people with skills in different areas. I mean, you can't expect a clinician is able to treat patients, product develop, do the AI, do all of those sorts of things. It's about, we can no longer do things in silos. We have to be integrated. We have to have capabilities, specific capabilities in regulatory science, PKPD, clinical aspects, diagnostics, electronics, AI. So to say that clinicians are going to be the solution, I think is very, very dangerous. They are part of a broader, integrated team as part of that solution.
I completely agree with you, but we do also need to be able to train them up in such a way that that's appreciated and that they're aware.
Agreed.
I think so. I think other disciplines outside of medicine or clinical medicine have this appreciation because they actually have to gain insights to further either their idea or their development. I think the challenge for medicine and clinicians is actually how do you open up medical training to the outside world to appreciate that, or at least even know it's there. Because medical training and clinical training has always been fundamentally patient-focused, patient first do no harm. So it's a slight paradigm shift. I mean, they're integral in terms of setting it up, but then how do you actually expose medical students, but even practicing clinicians to this bigger outside world there? That's becoming more complex.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
There's a big outside world that clinicians have been dealing with. They've been dealing with technologies. I think of MRI and radiology, so that's a technology, and some people are specialising in that, but other clinicians who are using that, they've learned to interpret that and they can see, and so it's once you get to a certain point, it kind of becomes turnkey,
Yeah, I agree, but I think this is where the strength of our institutions and our academic institutions are so critical in bringing those insights. And look, I give you a personal example of when I was a medical student and I learnt neuroanatomy. In a decade, it changed from actually having a brain and you would sit there and you go through it to then actually just looking at cross sections of brain. And this was when CT scanning and MRI scanning was actually coming through. So it was already started to be embedded in the core curriculum of the course that then would prepare you for that in clinical practice. So that's where academia, I think, is so crucial.
We were speaking about academia before we came in, and across the Commonwealth there's a mutual recognition of the value of higher education. And if you look across the Commonwealth universities, there was an article in the Times Higher recently showing the level of collaboration between the HEIs across the Commonwealth. Is there something here around being able to heal the Commonwealth in that we should be looking at new training programs across the Commonwealth to start bringing those individuals together? And are people seeing examples of that through the academic and clinical institutions or industry that are reflecting the discussion we've been having about the role of the clinician, the data, the collaboration? Any great examples out there? Yes.
I can point to one. The Medical Technologies and Pharmaceuticals Growth Centre, so MTP Connect, have recently funded a collaboration between Monash University and Satara. It's a global sort of a health company working in software and modelling, and that's about training the next generation of health-capable software modelers, regulatory scientists, PKPD, and specific postgraduate training, so that where they will be embedded with industry, learning the skills that they require and being able to do product development itself. So I think that's a great initiative where there's a recognition that, yes, you have the higher education, but you have to have the expertise and the hands-on engagement. And so that's part of that particular program that I'm aware of.
And I think universities at their best can be very much along the lines of what you've just said. So I reflect on my experience when I was at Oxford, and the people that I work with from all parts of the world. Many of us went back to the parts of the world where we're from, and those links are very Commonwealth-based, and there's those common links of language, and there was jokes about cricket. Yes, it hurts with the cricket ball thing, but those things actually matter, and we have more in common than not.
Mark, in the context of antimicrobial resistance, I'm involved with the UK Antimicrobial Resistance Centre, and something that we're working on is the fact that we only have a handful of people actually going through academia learning about this. So to then have an army to work against the bugs is a real problem. Are you seeing anything in the training and the development of the next generation of academics and clinicians coming through to be able to support some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's not only in academics and industry as well. So, you know, in the 1980s, there were maybe 20 large pharma companies that were investing in antibiotic research with over 10 to 20,000 researchers. And we estimate that in companies now, there's less than 1,000 researchers actively involved in antibiotic research. So there's a great need to be, there's this collective loss of knowledge, and antibiotics are different from other drugs in how they're developed and the processes that they need to go through. So you have this massive collective loss of knowledge that needs to be, kept somehow. So there are some programs. So there's an initiative called CARBEX, which has been running antibiotic discovery boot camps at conferences about once or twice a year. So that's helping to train up the next generation of researchers. We're running an initiative called the Community for Open Antimicrobial Drug Discovery, which is a Wellcome Trust-funded global initiative trying to engage academic chemists to test their compounds for antibiotic activity. And part of this is not just trying to discover antibiotics, but it's trying to actively engage other researchers into helping to discover antibiotics and build that enthusiasm and build up a research community and provide them training as well. And part of the CARBEX initiative is they're developing these accelerators, which are designed to specifically provide advice to companies and to academics on how to progress from a discovery all the way through to clinical trials.
And that involves the commercialization, which
Yeah, and collaboration is important, but competition also drives a certain amount of progress. And there's a lot of competition in academia. A lot of discussion, a lot of sharing, but there's a lot of competition there. There's a lot of competition even within a department within a single institution. And then on the commercialization front, there is competition as well, and some of that can be national, some of that can be around specific companies. But actually, in the clinical setting, in healthcare centers, there's a great opportunity for collaboration because those centers are treating their population, and that really doesn't compete with another hospital in another country that has its population to treat. So I think there's much more probably sharing of practices along the clinical piece, and much opportunities for collaboration there than we probably take advantage of.
We've seen in times of crisis, we've spoken today about antimicrobial resistance around Ebola, that people almost put their competitive differences to one side to collaborate at pace and at scale, and suddenly you see hundreds of millions of pounds that wasn't there before suddenly becoming available to tackle a disease, and you're wondering, how did that come about? Now, that's happened in those crisis areas, but as a question that's come here saying more people die this year from obesity-related diseases than starvation. Do you think we can start to see that same level of pace and scale of collaboration, putting competition to one side to deal with some of the chronic diseases like pain in the same way? We seem to deal with the acute very well. We don't seem to deal with the chronic, and not really seeing many Commonwealth or international partnerships around those chronic disease settings. Be interested to hear from the panel if you agree. Got heads nodding here. In pain, do we see people working collaboratively to solve this?
There are international collaborations, no doubt about it, and a new one that got announced a couple of days ago was the FDA have brought in, the NIH have announced a new initiative called HEAL, H-E-A-L, helping to end addiction long term. And in that are embedded a number of programs, but will that be taken up? Yes, it will, because there's now $500 million of new money. So there was already $600 million, and now it's going to $1.1 billion new money to deliver these collaborative efforts as a means to address chronic pain and the so-called opioid crisis that is affecting the US and Australia to a lesser extent. And so that would be applicable internationally. So there'll be international groups working together to deliver the solutions.
Thank you.
Oh, you see a lot of large international consortia approaching, particularly in genetics, approaching some chronic diseases like schizophrenia and other psychiatric diseases, but also some of the neurodegenerative diseases. Some of these collaborations are now serving up studies in which they have 50,000 subjects, which you could only get by a huge collaboration internationally. So I think that, and a classic example of the way some of this collaboration can go is that I think her name was Nancy Wexler, and in the late 1980s, she promoted collaboration around Huntington's disease, and that she brought all the people who are working in Huntington's disease together and said, listen, I'm from the patient population here, stop squabbling, get together as a collaboration. And they did, and they found the mutation that was responsible for Huntington's disease. Unfortunately, it's been a very tricky biological problem, and 20 years later they haven't found what to do with it to treat the disease. But academics are not always competing, and they can collaborate widely, but they do have to have a change of mind about their own personality in a larger collaboration.
And they've got to be able to recognise a mutual benefit from that.
A mutual benefit and a commitment to the patients, really, and the disease. That's the thing, rather than their own ego.
Yeah. We were speaking earlier about that mutual benefit, because to solve some of these big challenges, it's not necessarily going to be about the device, the product, the service. It's going to be about how you solve the care pathway. And that's going to involve academics, clinicians, businesses, NGOs, and government. And what we need is getting that mutual recognition. The public-private sector partnership that GSK has been involved in a number of them is one way. Do you see other models of bringing people together, or do we need new solutions, new commercial models to bring the likes of people across this room together to solve some of these challenges?
Yeah, it's a good but really challenging question, I think. In terms of new models, well, I think that new models come out of public discussion and public debate and sharing of ideas. And I think the more opportunity that there are to share these ideas between these partners is where the new models will actually come from, in terms of a better and maybe a deeper understanding of either what drives them or what their core business or their goals are. And sometimes they can be aligned, and sometimes they can be mutually exclusive. But I think as our societies develop and become more educated, and we live in democracies, we actually have a say. And I think this is where a new power, and be it through social media or through social forces or change, I think this is maybe the catalyst or the pot where these ideas are actually put together, and what comes out of it then, I think, hopefully will be as a result of that. But no, I don't have any new models, but I think the way forward is discussion and looking for common pathways.
You know, this question about obesity is interesting because many chronic diseases are correlated with obesity. So if you can provide someone with a replacement heart when they're 60 someday, or a new liver, what will be the incentive to living a healthy life? And so there will be this, and that will be different across different countries and developed countries versus developing over time. But this is a bit of a conundrum as we drive technology forward and then try to do the preventative approaches of just making people healthier and eating better.
Well, touching on that, so the biggest killer on the planet is lifestyle diseases. Yeah. You talked a little while ago about what's sexy, what's not. Lifestyle diseases is not very sexy. And we've got a real issue there because there's a complete lack of feedback. So if you're eating your chips or crisps, depending on what part of the world you do that. You don't realise you're setting up a ticking time bomb if you keep doing that. When there's a crisis, we do respond, and typically brings out the best in people. But the hard part is that there's an evolving crisis that's going on in the narrative of the individual with obesity, and we need to find ways to address that.
Government could tax differently. I mean, that's one thing that a government could do, or across Commonwealth is, chips could be taxed higher because later they're going to...
Sugar tax?
Yeah, the sugar tax in the UK.
So something like that.
So I've got the challenge of trying to wrap this amazing discussion up. We've covered a huge amount. Next week, leaders from the respective Commonwealth are going to meet in London at Chogham to discuss how businesses can engage and work across the Commonwealth. I'll give you just a few seconds to think, what would be your individual messages to your representatives going to Chogham in terms of what we could be doing through business engagement across the Commonwealth in the context of healing the people of the Commonwealth? I'm going to start, and last time I started with Marie first. Marie, you've got more time to think this time, so this time I'm going to start with Mark, work our way back, and then we'll draw to a close.
Well, I'll jump to the AMR issue and need to come up with a way to incentivize companies to get back into doing antibiotic discovery. So there's some initiatives, particularly there's a report that came out from the European Union on ways to provide pull incentives where, if you develop an antibiotic, there's a market reward to produce it and potentially not actually use it, keep it in reserve. So I think that needs to be high on the agenda for a government meeting, because it can't be done by one country. It has to be an international effort to do that.
Thank you. Mark.
Healthcare doesn't come packaged in one particular country or in a region. So the problem's far bigger than individual nations. And I think we need to find ways to break down those barriers and partner.
Oh.
I would like to see us to get away and think differently about just the commercial, patent-driven drug discovery or drug development approach, because there are a lot of activities happening in universities which are non-patentable, and hospitals, and which they might be small changes, but they could lead to large healthcare changes. So we need a way to engage business. I really do believe we need to have the business community and the governments, people who will benefit from some of these changes, contributing in a new financial model. I've been pushing in this last year a medical bond, like a medical futures fund, but a lot of superannuation funds and insurance companies tell me it's impossible, but I keep thinking we need this conversation that Michael talked about, to not just concentrate on patents, which is driving a lot of great research in driving our drugs, but there's a lot of discovery out there which is not being translated.
Thank you. Well,
yeah, so innovation is driven by networks, and you have information sharing and you have resource sharing. So I think we need to find better ways to share information among the Commonwealth, and then maybe be creative about sharing resources. I mean, right now, collaborations are often, I spend a certain amount of money in my country, you spend a certain amount of money in your country, and then you get 1 + 1 = 2, as opposed to 1 + 1 = 5 or 10. And I think the Commonwealth could look and say, what can this country really do well? What can this country do really well? Let's make them work together to get that synergy and allow money to flow a little differently among our institutions.
Okay. Thank you.
I think I'll come back to one of my first points, is just access to medical care and trying to even out amongst Commonwealth countries, particularly around vaccines and preventable diseases. And, I chose 3 of them. And I think having that understanding and maybe setting, minimums or benchmarks, particularly for countries that are transitioning from Gavi status to non-Gavi status, how will they maintain that? So how then will governments and departments of health interact with industry about maintaining immunisation programs?
Felicia, what would you say for your representative at CHOGM?
Yeah, so I think that Australia as a nation, the Commonwealth, and just in general around the world, we tend to be responsive. We don't seem to be prepared. We don't seem to have the mechanisms that are in place, and there is a lot of activity moving towards that. But I think to change that mentality of, responding to a crisis when it occurs, we need to set up the infrastructure and set everything up first. So I think if we can see continued investment in that, that would be one of my recommendations.
Thank you. And lastly,
yeah, I'd say that a Commonwealth-wide funded program to foster the cross-disciplinary relationships of postgraduate students across the Commonwealth.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all the panellists. I'd like to thank them for their contribution. I'm sure they're going to be hanging around so you can tackle them with questions we haven't been able to cover. Thank you for those of you who sent questions through, and thank you to the panel.
And your hats to wear for the weekend are on their way. Hakan, thank you to you too. Some of those questions were just fantastic and so tailored to what we're talking about. In fact, talking to Mario out the back, he started taking notes because he's addressing your last question, that topic at the Commonwealth Business Forum attached to CHOGM in London next week. So thank you very much. And if you had to look at the quality of speakers that we've had yesterday and today, you needn't go further than the cross-section that we currently have on stage right now. We also have last year's Australian of the Year in Alan here as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank our panel.